I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Is Professor Matthias Michel, assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. Matthias studies the philosophy of mind and science with a focus on how consciousness can be investigated scientifically. His work tackles big questions about the methods of consciousness research, what can happen unconsciously in the mind, and whether non-human animals might be conscious too. Please welcome Professor Matthias Michel.
All right, so I'm going to present some recent work on the evolution of consciousness and the functions of conscious vision in particular. So it's going to hopefully help us determine which animals consciously experience vision in that particular case, and which animals only see but unconsciously. Okay, so this is some work I've done with Steve Fleming. We have a recent paper in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences, PBS. This journal is such that whenever you publish there, you then have 40-something responses by experts in the field. So I'm currently in the process of answering about 150 pages of commentaries right now. Okay, so what is consciousness? This talk is going to be about phenomenal consciousness, so we need to know what it is. So the vague definition is that a mental state is conscious if there is something it's like for you to be in that state. Another way of defining it is to say that consciousness is subjective experience. Okay, so right now, for example, there is something it's like for you to hear the sound of my voice, to see me. Okay, your visual experience is not like behind your head where there's nothing. Okay? So there's something it feels like. Now, the question I'm going to be interested in today is the following. What is consciousness good for? Okay. Why is it that not all of our mental processes operate in the dark, so to speak? And in order to make progress on that question, I think it's helpful to focus on conscious vision first, for the simple reason that we know so much about vision. So this talk is going to have 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to argue that conscious perception is surprisingly slow in a sense that I'm going to define later. I'm going to then argue that this has deep consequences for how we think about the evolution and then distribution of conscious vision among animals. And then I'm going to conclude with some speculations about the functions of consciousness. So this talk is going to go from the least speculative part to the most speculative parts. Okay, I'm a philosopher, so I can speculate. I reserve the right to do that. Okay, so let's start with why do I think that conscious vision is slow? First, what do I mean by that? So suppose I show you a red dot like this one. So you're looking at this red dot. At some point, light emitted from there will hit your retina. At some point later, it will enter the first stage of cortical processing in V1. At some point later, we don't know when, at some point you'll have a conscious experience as of seeing the red dot. You'll consciously experience the red dot. Now, unless you have an immaterial soul, this stuff has to take some time, okay? It's not immediate. So how long does it take? Well, we know that it takes about 50 milliseconds for the information to reach V1. Okay? And then the question is, how long does it take from there, or in total, before you consciously experience the stimulus? Again, it cannot be immediate. It has to take some time. So that's what I mean by the speed of consciousness. The speed of conscious vision is how fast one becomes conscious of a stimulus after its onset. Now, the question of the speed of consciousness matters because if you think about it for 5 seconds, all the vision-related neurocognitive processes that happen faster than conscious vision have to happen unconsciously. Why? I mean, if something happens before conscious vision, it has to happen based on unconscious vision. right? So that's why studying the speed of consciousness can tell us a lot about which functions then require consciousness. In particular, the main point for us is going to be that if conscious perception is slow, suppose it takes you more than 300 milliseconds in order to be conscious of a stimulus visually. That means that conscious vision cannot be involved in fast reactions to visual stimuli, okay? Those reactions will have to be triggered by unconscious vision. So here's Muhammad Ali, just dodging extremely fast. If conscious vision takes about 300 milliseconds, let's say, he has to do that based on some kind of unconscious vision. Okay. More generally, I think the question matters a lot because it really marks a very important division or distinction between two families of views one could have about the role of consciousness in our mental lives. The first family of views says that consciousness is for seeing and reacting. Okay? They're going to say that consciousness is fast. In order to see properly, you really need consciousness. In order to react to your environment, you need consciousness. The other family of views is going to say that consciousness is slow. Consciousness is not for seeing proper. You could have unconscious vision, like in blind sight patients, for example. Okay? You could have unconscious vision. What consciousness is for, what consciousness adds, is the capacity to think based on what you see. So those are predictive theories of consciousness, like the global workspace theory or higher order theories. And on the side where people think consciousness is fast, those are more sensory theories of consciousness. Okay. So I'm going to argue that you should be on this side. Even if we disagree on the details, at least you should be thinking that it's more on the slow side. Now, the obvious question is here, but Matthias, how can we study the speed of consciousness? Good question. So I'm going to argue that, well, there are various ways of doing it. I think most of them are quite bad. We can talk about them during Q&A. Here's one I think is good. It's to use so-called postdictive effects to identify a lower bound for the speed of consciousness. So in postdictive effects, perception of a stimulus presented at time t depends on events at time t plus 1. So that should sound weird, but if you think about it for 5 seconds, it's actually possible because of the lag, the processing lags inside your brain. So here's an example. If I show you a red dot for 30 milliseconds, say, you're going to see it very, very clearly if it's not masked by anything, okay? And if the contrast is high. Now, if I show you the same red dot for 30 milliseconds, and then I wait a bit, and then I present a green dot for 30 milliseconds, you're not going to see red then green. Instead, the two dots are going to fuse into a single unified yellow dot. Okay? Now, note that this is very weird. That's where postdiction enters the picture. That's very weird because it's as if the green dot is going back in time to change the way you see the red dot. Okay? So that's a postdictive effect. Perception of a stimulus, the red dot, is changed by a stimulus that comes later. All right. Now, why is that important? Because it's important. That means that you did not consciously perceive the red dot before at least 60 milliseconds. Why? Well, think about it. Had it taken less than 60 milliseconds to consciously perceive the red disk, the green disk would have arrived too late to change your conscious perception of the red disk. So had it taken less than 60 milliseconds for you to consciously perceive the red disk, you would have seen red then green. But instead, you don't see that at all. So the red and green disks must have been processed unconsciously, and what you see is the result of this unconscious integration. Okay, so that's an example of how we can use postdictive effects to identify a lower bound for the speed of consciousness. I insist on the lower bound aspect here because I just have 30 minutes. I will not explain why it's just a lower bound, but that's important to keep in mind. So there are many, and by that I mean many many effects like these in the 200 milliseconds range. So here I'm just going to give 2 examples because I think they're pretty nice. The first one I want to mention is by Sugita and colleagues in 2018. And this effect uses the Poggendorf illusion. So in the Poggendorf illusion, you are actually presented with collinear line segments, but you see them as having an offset as being non-collinear because there's a rectangle in between them. Okay? Do you all see the illusion? Well, do you all get the illusion? Okay. So you should see a slight offset. They should seem non-aligned. Okay. So here's what you can do. What they did is that they showed the lines as being aligned. Okay? So they are aligned. The line segments are aligned. And then later on, they presented the rectangle. And what they found is that the rectangle can positively change the way the lines appear. Okay? So what you see is really the result of the unconscious integration of the lines and the rectangle. Okay? The way you perceive the lines depends on what's going to happen 200 milliseconds after I show you the lines. So interestingly, you can even get effects like these across sensory modalities. So for example, you can get a postdictive McGurk effect. So in the McGurk effect, if you see someone say ba, 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 and at the same time, but that's muted, and at the same time you hear fa, 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 your brain is going to integrate the auditory stream and the visual stream in a way that's going to make you hear, I should have said, you hear ga, 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 and the fusion of the two make you hear fa, 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 fa. Okay? So you're going to integrate the auditory percept and the visual percept. Now, it turns out that you can do this even if there's a lag between vision and audition. You're still going to integrate the two. Here I show you it works even with a 200 milliseconds lag. But if you think about it, that means that during those 200 milliseconds, audition must have been unconscious. Okay? It must have been unconscious because otherwise, what you see would have arrived too late to change what you hear. Okay? Now, these effects are pretty nice, but they're still not all that impressive compared to so-called long-lasting postdictive effects, which are postdictive effects around 300 milliseconds and above, so that are reviewed in these 2 papers. The next experiment I'm going to talk about was carried out by Drissi Daoudi, Doerig, and Michael Herzog, and it involves the so-called sequential metacontrast paradigm. So this paradigm uses stimuli that are called Vernier stimuli, which is very easy to pronounce if you're French. So Vernier stimuli are just superimposed bars like this, okay, with an offset either to the right, in which case it's a Vernier or pro-Vernier, or to the left, in which case an anti-Vernier. Okay? One feature of these stimuli that's quite nice if you do psychophysics is that they integrate extremely well. Okay? So if I show you a Vernier followed by an anti-Vernier, what you're going to see is not this and this. Instead, what you're going to see is a single fused neutral Vernier. Okay? So note that this already means that those two have been processed unconsciously. Okay, so you saw this and then this unconsciously, and again, what you're conscious of, what you consciously experience, is just the unconscious, the result of this unconscious integration. Okay, so here's how the experiment goes. You show participants a stream of Vernier, okay, like this, and that's going to create an illusion of movement, of motion. Now, if you start the stream with a Vernier, what's going to happen is that instead of seeing this followed by this, a Vernier followed by neutral Vernier like this, what people are going to see is the offset of the first Vernier being transported all along the stream. Okay? So they're going to see the offset transported all along the stream. Here, they're told to attend to the stream on the right. Okay. And that's why you get the offset transported to the right. Now, this works postdictively. So if you start the stream with neutral Vernier, and then you present an anti-Vernier, you're not going to see neutral Vernier followed by an anti-Vernier. You're going to see the stream from the start as starting with an anti-Vernier. And you're going to see this offset transported all along the stream like this. Okay? Now, remember that this one and this one cancel one another. Okay? So that means that you should be able to do this. Start the stream with a Vernier. You follow this with neutral Vernier. And then you present an anti-Vernier. And what you find is that indeed they cancel one another across space and time. Okay? So note that the first one I talked about and are perceptual metamers. So they are indistinguishable. Okay? But the second one is the result of the unconscious integration of a Vernier and anti-Vernier, while the first one is veridical. That's really what was there. So the anti-Vernier cancels the Vernier that came 130 milliseconds earlier, and that means that this one must have been processed unconsciously for at least 130 milliseconds. So you didn't consciously perceive the Vernier before 130 milliseconds, since whether you perceive it or not depends on what happens after 130 milliseconds. Think about it this way. Had you perceived it consciously before that, you'd have seen this and then this. But instead, you don't. You just see this. Okay. Now, the question is, how far can we push this exactly? So that's 130 milliseconds, but can we push this farther? And guess what? You can. And you can in a way that is kind of amazing. What Drissi Daoudi and colleagues have discovered is that presenting an anti-Vernier about 400 milliseconds after the first one changes your perception of the entire stream. So let me walk you through this figure, which is a bit complicated. The way they did it is that people are calibrated to be 75% correct for discriminating the orientation of the first one. Okay? So if I just present you a Vernier, they're going to see the entire stream like this, and they're 75% correct for identifying whether the first one that was presented was like this or like this, okay? Vernier or anti-Vernier. Now, here's what happens if you present an anti-Vernier 450 milliseconds after, and you ask people what was the orientation of the offset as you were watching the stream. Okay? People fall to chance. Okay? They're going to tell you that the orientation was, I don't know, I just saw a stream of neutral Vernier. I didn't see an offset at all. That's what people are going to say. Now, if you adopt a slightly more rigorous test and you ask people, you don't just ask people about their impression, but you ask people, okay, just tell me what the orientation of the first one was, and you force them to choose between like this or like this. Here they fall from 75% to chance for all the observers after 290 milliseconds, and from 75% to chance for half the observers after 450 milliseconds. Okay. So another interesting result is that they've discovered that the window of unconscious sensory integration is fixed with a 450 milliseconds maximum from the start of the stream. That means that if you look at this, 0 and 8 are going to integrate, but 8 and 12 are not going to integrate, even though 8 and 12 are closer in space and time compared to 0 and 8. And you can even do it like this. So if you present the Vernier at number 8 here, 8 and 12 are not going to integrate together. Why? Because there's a window of unconscious sensory integration that starts, and it's a discrete episode. Okay? Once the window has closed, nothing is going to integrate with what was presented during this window. So it's not a sliding window like this. Instead, you get discrete episodes where the window opens, you integrate, you experience. The window opens, you unconsciously integrate, you get an experience. So these experiments seem to suggest a lag of about 400 milliseconds during which you're unconscious of the Vernier stimuli. Okay? You unconsciously process the stimuli, and what you consciously experience is the result of this process of unconscious integration. Now you might think, well, but motion is weird, but we can still get effects like this one without motion. So for example, if you use TMS to V1, and you present a Vernier followed by an anti-Vernier, what you find is that you can manipulate what people are going to report seeing by applying TMS to V1 up to 370 milliseconds after you've presented the stimuli. Okay. So that means, again, that you didn't consciously see it before 350 milliseconds, since the way you see it depends on what happens after that. So long-lasting postdiction shows that there can be a lag of about 400 milliseconds in the most extreme cases, during which unconscious processing of stimuli occurs. So even if you think that's exaggerating, even with just take a conservative, give me a conservative estimate of 300 milliseconds, that's already too fast for conscious vision to play a role in that's already too slow, sorry, for conscious vision to play a role in fast reactions to visual stimuli. So you've just seen baseball is a sport where you have to react extremely fast to visual stimuli. Badminton is another case, for example. Think about Formula One drivers who have to react extremely fast. If that's right, all of those reactions to visual stimuli are driven unconsciously. And of course, this whole story fits very well with significant evidence that vision for action is largely unconscious based on the two visual streams hypothesis by Melgoodale and David Milner. Here's my favorite example of this, which is what happens in the hollow face illusion. So in the hollow face illusion, a convex face can appear concave and vice versa. Okay? And what Melgoodale and colleagues did is that they created a 3D model of this illusion, and they put targets on those faces. Now, they had two conditions. In one condition, you had to draw the position of the target. And obviously, when that happens, people are subject to the illusion. They're going to draw the target as being farther from what it actually is. Okay? Now, here's the second condition. In a second condition, they ask people, instead of drawing the position of the target, they ask them to flick the targets off of the faces. And what you find when you ask people to flick the targets off of the faces is that their hand movements are not subject to the illusion. Okay? And that's, note, that's without physical feedback. Okay? So the measurement here is taken during the point of maximal velocity, I think, in your gesture. Okay, so that's a case where conscious perception represents the concave face as convex, but vision for action, accurately actually, represents the concave face as concave. So that's a case where you get a dissociation between conscious perception and vision for action, because vision for action depends on this unconscious visual stream. Okay. So it's kind of crazy to think that when you act, when I grab something, the details of my motor commands are driven by an unconscious visual stream, really. Okay, so all of this, I think, suggests a model like this one, which is advocated by Michael Herzog. The idea is that you unconsciously accumulate sensory evidence, and then you get bursts of conscious experience in between those periods of about 300 milliseconds, where you're actually not visually conscious of anything. Importantly, in order for you not to die pretty fast, you still need to be able to respond based on this unconscious information, okay? So I'm not saying that vision in general takes 300 milliseconds. I'm saying that conscious vision takes 300 milliseconds. But before that, you can respond based on unconscious vision. All right, so the interim conclusion is that conscious vision is slow, surprisingly so, and that conscious vision is not for immediate vision-based reactions. Immediate reactions to visual stimuli are driven by unconscious vision. So I'm going to move to the second part now, which is going to be much shorter. So most of what I'm going to say here is based on the fantastic work of Malcolm McIver. If you want a very good review of this, there's a review by Malcolm McIver and Barbara Finlay that is very good. Okay, so suppose that you're driving and pretty far ahead there's a deer that's about to cross the road. Because you can see the deer from pretty far, you'll have time to adjust, you'll have time to plan, to think about what you're seeing, okay? You'll have time to adjust, you're going to avoid having an accident. Now, suppose the situation is different. Suppose instead that you're driving on a foggy road at night. In that situation, you have what we are going to call a short sensory horizon, which just means that you just can't see very, very far. Okay? Given a short sensory horizon, if there's a deer there, you will not have time to think about what you see. You will not have time to plan based on what you see. Instead, you're going to rely on fast vision in order to react as fast as possible. Okay? Now, that means that there's a direct relation between the size of your sensory horizon, how fast you have to react, and therefore whether you act based on conscious vision or based on unconscious vision. Given a short sensory horizon, that's going to impose fast reactions, and that's going to make you rely instead of conscious vision on unconscious vision. Now, take a scene like this one. It should be obvious from seeing this that in this environment, the sensory horizon is pretty limited. But actually, there's a field called sensory ecology that is studying this. And here's a finding from this field, is that the diameters of the visibility bubbles, what I've called the sensory horizons, in clear oceanic water are often 1 to 2 orders of magnitude larger than the body length of animals. In murky coastal and estuarine water, exhibiting much more absorption and scattering, the diameters of the visibility bubbles are instead in the same order of magnitude as body length. So that means that aquatic animals have very, very short sensory horizons. Okay? So fish in particular, aquatic animals in general, are always in a situation in which they have to react very, very fast to opportunities and threats in the environment. For instance, it's been estimated that you have groups of cells in zebrafish larvae that can trigger an escape response to looming stimuli in just 10 milliseconds, okay, 5 to 10 milliseconds, which is extremely, extremely fast. So because of their sensory horizons, aquatic animals have to rely on fast reactions to visual stimuli. And again, this is just not what conscious vision is for. Okay? They have to rely instead on unconscious vision. Now, things are totally different after the evolutionary transition to land. So as McIver writes, the 1,000-fold higher transparency of air translates to a 100-fold increase in visual range. Since we evolved the neck, you can also think in terms of sensory volumes. The sensory volume has increased 1,000,000-fold. Okay. All the opportunities and threats formerly seen a few body lengths ahead, often forcing high behavioral urgency, can be seen now at a more comfortable distance and confers the possibility to use more extensive processing for lower urgency behavior. So the general lesson is that after the water-to-land transition and the massive increase in sensory horizon, organisms can now afford the relative sluggishness of conscious vision. In other words, they can now think on the basis of what they see. Okay? They can now use vision for cognition, for planning, not just for reaction, for immediate reactions to visual stimuli. Okay, let me finish with the most speculative part. So as McIver argued, long sensory horizons lead to the emergence of model-based planning. You don't just have a model of the world, you can use that model in order to draw inferences. Why? Because now you have time to do so. Underwater, you didn't have any time to do so because you had a short sensory horizon. So animals not only form an internal model of the world, they draw inferences using that model. But here's the problem with this. Here's the problem that you face if you are a model-based planner. Agents that are capable of model-based planning risk becoming uncoupled from their environment. So let me explain this. There are actually two problems here. The first is that the model-based simulation that you're running shouldn't change the model itself. I'm going to call that the reality monitoring problem. The second problem is that building a model for planning shouldn't take so long that now the model is no longer valid. And I'm going to call that Hamlet's problem in perception. So let me explain the first problem, the reality monitoring problem. So suppose that you're walking next to a fence, and behind you, you hear a dog barking. So your mind is going to construct a model, an internal model of this situation. You're going to represent that situation. And based on that representation, you're going to draw inferences. You're going to use this internal model to draw inferences about what might happen. Here's one inference that you should not draw. One inference that you should not draw is that there is now actually an aggressive dog jumping over the fence. Okay? That means that in order to use model-based planning, you need to be able to distinguish between what's actually out there, reality, and your simulation. You need to keep those apart somehow. Okay? So that's the reality monitoring problem. This capacity to distinguish reality from simulation is the reality monitoring capacity. Without reality monitoring, model-based planners are going to be uncoupled from their environment. Okay? So that's for the reality monitoring problem. Now let's turn to Hamlet's problem. So let's come back to this. If you have a short sensory horizon, then the environment itself is going to impose a very strict limit to how long you can wait before reaching a perceptual decision about what's actually out there. Okay? So if you have a short sensory horizon, you're never really free to flexibly determine how much evidence you should get before reaching a perceptual decision. The environment imposes a strict time constraint on you. So with short sensory horizons, the environment imposes a strict limit, a time limit to reach a perceptual decision. However, once there's the transition to land and you have an increase in sensory horizon, evidence accumulation can now last much longer. Okay? So you're going to be able to reach more reliable perceptual decisions. So a long sensory horizon means that you can basically wait until you get a better idea of what's out there. So your model, your internal model, is going to be much more reliable, and then your inferences based on that model are going to be more reliable. So that gives rise to what we call Hamlet's problem in perception, which is how to tell when to stop accumulating perceptual evidence and actually reach a perceptual decision. And if you think about it, there's a kind of dilemma. If you think about it in the model, the question becomes how long unconscious integration of evidence should last. Here's the dilemma. If it's too short, your model is not going to be reliable. Okay? You won't have enough evidence. But if it's too long, you're going to be dynamically uncoupled from the environment because you're going to rely on the model from yesterday in order to perform inferences, in order to draw inferences about what's going to happen now. Okay? So you don't want that. So you want flexibility. You want a model that is reliable, but also coupled to the environment. So your model building should happen pretty fast. So what Steve and I suggest is that inside your head, a reality monitoring system can solve both problems at once. So together with Steve Fleming and other researchers like Haquan Lau, we think that there is a reality monitoring system that sits at the interface between perception and cognition. More precisely, the reality monitoring system is a system of high-order representations indicating which of your representations reflect the world as it is now. And so that's going to fix a set of representations as the current model of the world as it is now for the purposes of model-based planning. And the claim is that at any moment, at any moment, what you consciously experience is the set of representations, is the content of the set of representations that have been selected as reliably reflecting the world as it is now. Okay? So you get those unconscious windows of integration, and then the reality monitoring system fixes a model. That's what you experience. And you do that again and again and again. Okay. So let's come back to our two problems to see how they're solved by the view. It's pretty straightforward to see how the reality monitor solves the reality monitoring problem. It's going to select representations in order for them to have a direct impact on your beliefs about the current state of the world. So that explains why your simulations are almost all the time unconscious. Okay? You're running simulations all the time. Almost none of them are conscious. Okay? That's because the reality monitor does its job very well. I just want to point out that this also explains another way puzzling fact, which is that experiences remain remarkably coherent despite many, many representations coexisting at any given time in your head and being used for a wide variety of purposes. So for instance, there's good evidence that short-term memory maintenance, expectations, planning, and memory, all of those recruit sensory representations. So the question is, why isn't your perception just a jumble of meaningless features that you're representing now? Why is your conscious experience coherent? So here's a cool example from Jeremy King and Valentin Viard from a few years ago, where they showed that if you show people a stream of Gabor patches like this, you can actually decode the orientation of those Gabor patches for quite some time in the brain. Okay? But then that begs the question of why do you only see one at a time, or at least a coherent sequence at a time, and not just a set of Gabor patches all overlapping, right? And the response might be that even though many stimuli are represented at a time, only a coherent sequence is tagged by the reality monitor as reliably reflecting the world as it is now. So that solves that problem. Now for Hamlet's problem, I'm going to be very quick. If you think about it, if you have a system that monitors the reliability of your representations of your world model, it's also going to be ideally positioned to open and close windows of unconscious sensory integration. So coming back to this model, basically the way we think about it, it works a bit like this. So you get unconscious evidence accumulation. At some point, the reality monitor is going to represent or tag those representations as being reliable. And if it doesn't reach a threshold of reliability, it's going to extend this window of sensory integration. Okay? So that's going to solve Hamlet's problem in perception, because now you have a system that flexibly opens and closes windows of sensory integration. So let me conclude now. I think the main point I wanted to make today is that conscious vision is surprisingly slow and is therefore unlikely to drive fast reactions to visual stimuli. So, even in cases like the kinds of cases we heard about now, about covert consciousness, I think it's very, very important to realize that many, many fast reactions to visual stimuli can be driven totally unconsciously. Okay? Those are not good evidence of consciousness. I further argued that short sensory horizons for aquatic animals impose fast reactions to visual stimuli, and that's just not what conscious vision is for. So I think fish, for example, have blind sight, basically. They do not consciously experience vision. Their responses to visual stimuli are driven by unconscious vision. And finally, I've argued that following the perceptual reality monitoring theory of consciousness, which was developed by Haquan Lau, conscious vision could be a solution to two computational problems arising from the increase in sensory horizon after the water-to-land transition. The first problem being the need for reality monitoring, and the second one being Hamlet's problem in perception. So I'm a bit late, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was going to ask a question about your determination of conscious vision in aquatic animals. And I know you made your case because the visual field is much more diminished than it is on the land. But I also was curious because the amount of time you gave the fish to have time to process vision, you based it on the human experiments. And so I was wondering if you thought there was any chance that fish process vision faster, or they have conscious perception faster than humans do, and then therefore they could have.
Yeah, the argument, note, is not that, that's a good question. I think I should have been clearer. The argument is not that since it takes 300 milliseconds in us, it has to take 300 milliseconds in fish, if it happens at all. The argument instead is that how slow conscious vision is tells us something about the function of conscious vision, or at least tells us something about what the function of conscious vision is not, namely fast reactions to visual stimuli. But given their environment, vision in fish is tailored to fast reactions to visual stimuli, and therefore is unlikely to be conscious. So it's really an inference from what conscious vision is not good for, to what they use it for, to whether it's conscious or not.
And you're saying then that you don't think fish have enough time to make the longer term conscious decision? Yeah.
But basically, the idea is that they don't have model-based planning on the basis of vision, so they don't think about what they see.
Hi, thank you for the talk. In your diagram of unconscious buffer and the experiences, you described our conscious experience stream of consciousness as a discrete moments.
Yeah.
And that felt intriguingly counterintuitive to me, because I do feel faster than that. I mean, my experience is not like 2 or 3 frames per second.
Yeah.
And when I see my screen, I can distinguish 60 frames per second versus more than that. So how can you explain? So what's your interpretation on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the 90s, Dan Dennett and Kinsburn made this point that we should be careful to distinguish between the properties of representational vehicles, so the stuff that's actually doing the representing, and represented properties. So take an example. You can have a 2D picture that represents a 3D scene. Okay? So the representational content, what the picture is representing, is indeed 3D. But the picture itself is 2D. It's two-dimensional. So the vehicle is 2D. In the same way, I think that when you get a conscious experience, it's discrete, but the conscious experience represents a large amount of time, or what happened in the last episode, so to speak. And that feels continuous, because your conscious experience, even though it is discrete, it represents events that are continuous in time. So it's not an illusion. It's more like the distinction between, even though you have a discrete experience, it can still represent a continuous events, just like even though you have a sheet of paper that is itself 2D, it can still represent a 3D picture. So it's difficult to wrap your head around this, but I think if you clearly distinguish between what's represented in experience and when the experience itself happens, I think it's helpful. I agree with you that it's counterintuitive. I hope it makes sense, though.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk, and it's a really refreshing way to study the whole concept of consciousness. So thank you for that. I was wondering about if we were to disentangle a little bit visual perception to what is regulated by the dorsal stream and what is regulated by the ventral stream. Would you say that conscious visual processing is perhaps slow in one of these two processing pathways, or is it equally slow in both processing pathways?
So I think it depends mostly on the ventral stream. And I think it also depends on feedback from prefrontal cortex. So in other papers, I've argued that we should think that the prefrontal cortex is very much relevant for conscious perception. And I think it must have to do between synchronies between activity in PFC and activity in the ventral stream. I think the dorsal stream, at least the feed-forward sweep, is probably happening unconsciously, based on the work from Milner and Goodale. Another thing that happens unconsciously is the activity of the superior colliculus. So there's pretty good evidence that a lot of behavior in blind sight is mediated by activity in the superior colliculus, and that happens unconsciously. And there are actually two streams. So that was, there's a nice review by Tadashi Isa, who has worked on blind sight monkeys, on the two subcortical streams, one of which goes from the retina to the superior colliculus to the thalamus, and the other one going more directly from the retina to the thalamus. And he argues that the first one, did I say thalamus? From the superior colliculus to the cortex, and the other one from retina, thalamus, cortex. Tadashi Isa has argued, based on his work on blind sight, that the pathway that involves the superior colliculus is mostly unconscious. And this is a structure that is very, very well preserved in fish. It's called the tectum.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a beautiful talk. I found it interesting that you bring all this clear evidence but seem to draw a weird conclusion from it. When you start out with consciousness as this experience of what it's like, and you bring Muhammad Ali's hits as something that is not related to consciousness, right? Of course it feels something for him what it's like to hit these people, which means that the contents of consciousness are essentially fake, right? They're a construct that is describing reality as best as we can from this coarse-grained vantage point. But it's not a problem that a part of consciousness is postdictive and other parts are predictive. Maybe also put more emphasis on the predictive parts. A lot of things that we consciously experience haven't happened yet. It's just our brain is quite certain that they're going to happen. And if they don't happen, that's not a big problem because you can edit your memories. And so this is what's happening. Consciousness is reconstructing its contents as needed because it only needs to represent the best model of reality that you can make. It doesn't need to be an accurate model of the reality as it's sensory processed. Right? So consciousness seems to be instrumental in the integration, or its contents seem to be an expression of the integration of information that we are making. It's not the cause of our actions. And yet, it can be predictive in the sense that the action that we perform actually can happen after the conscious event, or the stimulus that we perceive can also happen after we consciously perceive it. Yeah. Right? So this decoupling, I think, should be emphasized.
So one thing is, I don't think the contents are fake, because even though there's a lag, note that the contents of consciousness are still veridical. Namely, even if there's a lag of 300 milliseconds, before you throw the punch and when you feel like you've thrown the punch, it's still the case that that's really what happened. So your conscious experience is veridical in that case.
Not quite. You can walk down the stairs in the dark and the last step is missing. And you notice this mismatch retroactively because you already walked the stair and you perceived that you're walking the stair and suddenly there was no stair. Yeah. Right? It's a very weird feeling. You can also have magical tricks in which you direct the attention of the viewer in such a way that they think they see a certain thing, which actually didn't happen. Because you confabulate, you hallucinate, you filled in data that is not actually in the visual stream or in the perceptual stream.
Well, one thing I'm quite skeptical with the view that, that what we experience are predictions. For the reason you just gave, that then how do we explain how we can experience our predictions being violated? I pretty often experience my predictions being violated. If what I experienced were my predictions, I wouldn't experience that. Instead, I would experience my predictions. So it's difficult to square up with the idea that we often experience our predictions being violated. I had a second thing to say. Yeah, I forgot about it. Let's talk about it later.